You are my mother, but you also happen to be the last daughter of Gudina Tumsa. I want to start with a icebreaker with you because I've heard a lot of stories, so I have a lot of things to ask. But the first question that I would like to ask you is, from the stories I've heard, you were a bit of a jokester, and your father was also a humorous individual. Would you like to tell me a joke that you used to tell him?
No, I'm not a jokester at all. But he had a lot of sense of humor. If I start to tell, I'll start laughing and then I won't be able to tell. So it's better if we skip it.
Okay, we can skip it. That's okay. As I had mentioned, you were the last daughter. Mm-hmm. What was it like being the youngest in the Gudina Tumsa household? Was it a good experience?
It was a wonderful feeling being the last child. I was loved and pampered. So I enjoyed every bit as I was enjoyed as well. Mm.
I heard from your siblings who are listening that you were a bit of a spoiled child. You got privileges that nobody else got in the house. Do you agree with their analysis of your childhood?
Yeah, I was spoiled by my sister more than my parents, but I got to spend quite a bit of time with my father, and I played a lot. He played with me a lot more, I think, because I was the youngest.
One story that one of your siblings told me is that your father used to like getting massages. So he would call you in the morning and he would say, push on my leg, and if you can bend it, I'll give you 10 birr. I don't know the equivalent of that back then, but did you ever win? Did you ever get the money?
Never got the money. I don't think any of us got the money. He was just enjoying the massage. We wanted to hurt him. He said, try if you can hurt my foot. So we did everything possible to hurt him, but we never managed.
Never were able to.
Yeah.
That's okay. Can you tell us a fond memory that you have with your father? Something that you remember that comes to you a lot when you think about it?
Lots of fond memories. And one of them is, my dad didn't have much time. He was traveling. He was on the road all the time, around the country to remote areas, as well as traveling overseas. So he was not available because he had to travel. But what I cherish is that when he came home, he always took time. Even though he felt exhausted, he took time with us children. So we enjoyed just conversing with him. And he talked about, our lives, our schools, but also about politics, about society, most of all about his faith. And he's the one who taught us how to read the Bible in Afaan Oromo. So that was a beautiful time, reading the Bible together, singing hymns in Afaan Oromo. He wanted to make sure that we learned those hymns and reading in our native tongue, because the rest we learned at school. But something that the school didn't offer in those days is learning, reading, writing in our own tongue. So he made sure that we learned that. So we enjoyed that moment, singing together and reading the Bible together and having to hear what he had to say.
Yeah, actually your answer goes directly into my next question. I asked you for a fond memory and I was expecting a bit of a simple answer, but you mentioned a lot of life lessons that he taught you. And growing up with you, I can see now how his parenthood impacted your own parenthood with your children. What is the most important lesson that you learned from him throughout your life?
What I learned from him is that, he had his values and his faith, and it was very important to him that we knew, that he imparted his values on us. And the life lesson that I took from him was that I should pass that on to our children as well. And that is the faith and the Word of God and our identity. Yeah, that's something that I learned from him.
That's wonderful. And I was going to say the most important lesson that you learned from him is to care for the youth, as you do have a lot of initiatives with how you contribute to building youth in the church and your own family through schooling and whatnot. First of all, can you describe to us how much Gudina cared for the youth, his passion for the youth, with some examples if you can, and how did that impact your present day initiatives?
I remember when we used to bring our friends home, he took time with our friends. This is like we were maybe teenagers, and so we brought home our teenage friends. But if he was walking out or coming in, he sat down and talked with them. Not only ask them, where are you from and what do you do, but he would also engage in discussions with them. And another thing I remember is that, his office was located in Amiskilo, not too far from Sidiskilo, the university. So, university kids used to flock to him, and he gave them time and he talked to them. It could be a pastoral counseling, it could be like giving them duties. And in his church, I remember there was a strong youth program during his leadership. And I even remember the man who was in charge of that youth department, a person by the name of Takasta. Now he's a professor, but at the time he was a young man, and I remember him. Yeah.
That's really wonderful. I thought you would mention some stories like Gudina teaching discipleship class, and he taught 2 of his children, I believe, if I'm correct. Yeah. You can correct me. But to move on to the next question, I want to ask you, did you understand your father's work as it's deeper concepts, I would say, for a young woman like you were then? And did you understand why he put your family in danger?
Thinking back, I don't think I understood what his work was. I knew he was a pastor, and I knew how much he cared about the church and the people, but I didn't understand the depth of his work. Not until later, not until everything happened, and I was like in my 30s. I didn't understand. Yeah.
Like I said, his work was putting your family in danger, and I think it was in 1978, I believe, during his first arrest. Firstly, were any of your siblings still there when he was first arrested? And what was the mood of the family like during that first arrest?
None of my siblings were in the country. I was the only child left at home. So it was my parents and me. And I didn't see it as his work putting our lives in danger. But when he got arrested in 1978 in October for the first time, I remember it being very terrible. At the time, I think I was 15 or 16. So it was terrible to go to prison, the central police station, taking food there. Once in a while, we saw him from far. And my father was always busy and active and, engaged and engaging. But when I saw him in prison, he was just standing with other prisoners, and he was doing nothing, with his hands folded. So that was a very hard sight to see him not doing anything.
Yeah. I apologize. Just to take it back a little bit to 1976, I believe. You had a not older brother, but I think his name was Latera. He was a bit older than you, maybe I believe a year or so older than you. And you guys spent a lot of time together from the stories that I've heard. Sadly, Latera passed away. Firstly, could you tell us the what happened and how he passed away, how it affected the family. And I'm aware that Gudina preached a sermon at his son's funeral on the topic of the power of the resurrection. Do you recall any of that?
Yeah, at the time I was 15 and Latira was 17. And he didn't get sick for too long. He had been sick only for 3 days, and he passed away. And my father came back from the United States, where he was at the time, and he preached on the funeral, and everybody admired that. How could he preach? In this kind of circumstance in our country, people take death very hard. Of course, a 17-year-old dying was not easy, especially on my mother. Was not easy. It was not easy on me because, we were very close. We played together and prayed together, and it was not easy for the family. It was a hard time, but we stuck together and we spent a lot of time, praying together, comforting each other.
And I believe it's a testament to his faith as well. Like you mentioned, some of your siblings had left the country, and sadly, your brother Latira had passed away. What was it like when you were the last child left in the house? From stories I've heard, there was almost 16 of you in the house at once, and all of a sudden it was 3 of you. What was that change like? And what advice did your father give you when you were the last one left?
It was hard living in a house without my siblings, but the times were very hard. So I was more focused on what was going on. And at the same time, I was in high school. So that kept me busy. But at the same time, the situation was very gloomy and dark, and we were afraid, and we were worried, whether my dad would be arrested because he was in and out of prison. So that was a bit confusing and very hard. But what I remember for him and for myself was that my father had always been a very, religious person, very close to the Lord. But in those days, he got even closer to the Lord. And I remember him fasting and praying and attending church services outside of his church. He not only went to his church, but I remember him going to, like on Wednesdays. In those days, lunch breaks were long. Like you had lunch break for 2 hours because you didn't leave work at 5. Instead, they left work at 6. So he had 2 hours. And because he didn't eat lunch, he was fasting, he went to attend the program they had at Masarat Christos Church in Bole. So he attended that during lunchtime. And he said he didn't go in front like how, ministers and pastors do when they go to churches. No, he sat outside where there was an overflow crowd. And there wasn't, I remember there weren't proper benches. But he sat there and he attended. He didn't need to be, he didn't demand or ask to be treated any differently. At the time, he was very well known among evangelical circles because he was the one who, put together the Council of Churches.
The Council of Cooperation.
The Cooperation of Churches in Ethiopia. So he was very well known, but he was a very humble man. So he attended and he listened to others, and he was very different in that sense because he was a great preacher. And as you might have read in the books published about him, they called him the Ethiopian Billy Graham because he was a preacher. He preached. I remember that. He used to preach a lot and people liked him, and he was everywhere on preaching assignments. But he was ready to listen to other preachers, even though they were younger and maybe not as experienced and maybe not as anointed. But he was very willing to listen to them. Yes.
Speaking about the youth, we're aware that Gudina Tumsa believed that the youth were the foundation for the next generation and they should be participating in the evangelistic work so that they can continue the work that was begun by the older generation. How did Gudina apply that in your case, as you're a young woman living in his home? And how did he inspire present day in the church that you serve in? You established a group called Children of Destiny for the youth in that church. How did he inspire that?
I'm not sure whether he really wanted to influence me, but I was influenced by his life and his teachings. And as I mentioned before, we had time together, so we could learn a lot from him. Not only that, but he lived what he preached. So just looking at his life, observing his life, you could learn a lot from him. And as you said, yes, he paid a lot of attention to youth because he felt that they're the future. I remember one thing, I'm just trying to recall how he put it, but at one point, retired people were coming to the church, people who were, in pension. They were coming to the church, joining the church and, looking for employment. And somehow they were employed by the church. And at one point he was very angry and he said, Makana Jesus is not where pensioners gather. So he really believed in the youth and he wanted the youth to be involved, and he was right there with them, not only discussing, but in those days the youth were very much interested in the charismatic movement. It was relatively new in the country. And then the church elders were very angry. The leaders were not happy with that. But he became the mediator. And he said, no, you have to keep the youth. A man by the name of Baker writes about it, how he went to the seminary and tried to mediate by counseling the youth, but also by talking to the elders. He believed in the contribution of the youth for the church and also for nation building as well. For me, growing up, listening to him, really made me focus on children and youth. It's not only youth, but also children. And the Bible tells us how important it is to pay attention to children, because whatever you put in them in childhood, that's what they're going to be when they grow up. To train up a child, and when that child grows old, he or she will not depart from it. And because of that, for me, and because of the influence I got from my father, I felt that my ministry should be children's ministry, children and youth. So I focus more, even though, I do other types of ministry as well, I focus more on children and youth, the future of the country and the future of the church.
Move on to more questions about the time that you spent with him after your siblings had left in your later teenage years. I want to take you to a time where during Gudina's second arrest. Could you tell us how that arrest happened? And there's a special story with that arrest, not special, a hard story, an emotional story, but could you also tell us about your experience during that time?
His second arrest was 1978 in May. And at the time, he was taken from his office. Then I was going to school then, and I didn't visit him during the week because of school. And over the weekend, my mother and I took food to go see him. And then as I was standing there, he came out, and when I saw him, I was very emotional. And I started crying. And then I don't know, I thought at the time, because I cried, they came and, with machine guns, and they, encircled me. And then they said, okay, we're taking you. So they took me. My mother was very upset. And she said, you took my husband and now you're taking my child. What do you have left? And she was not afraid at all. She was a very courageous woman. She was not afraid. But I didn't say a word because I was very afraid. So they took me in, and I didn't quite understand. I thought they were just going to keep me there for a couple hours. But a couple hours turned to, weeks. And so I was in jail, and it was not like a regular kind of jail. They converted, in those days they were confiscating people's homes. So it was two houses next to one another, and they were separated by a short fence. So on the other side of the villa was, he was in that house, and I was on the other side of it. And for me, it was a horrible moment because, having my father there was not easy. But in addition to that, it was a new experience to be away from home and to be put in jail at that age. And then there was no security at all. I was sleeping with 16 men in one room. So I didn't know what was going to happen. These 16 men were like militias, like local militias. And this was behind Ras Hotel, the National Theater. These houses were located there. So, but more than that, what was very horrible and scary for me was the thought that, they might torture my father in front of me, because that's what they did in those days. They might take parents and torture them in front of children, or children in front of parents. And I remember them threatening my father, saying, unless you give in, we're going to torture your wife and your daughter in front of you. And his response was, if you want, you can crucify them. I'm not going to give in into anything that you're saying. I could see people, young people, tortured, not able to walk, open wounds, not treated. I saw this with my own eyes. And I remember one night, it was my turn. Before the night came, during the day, they called me in. And I sat with 8 officials, who were trying to get information out of me. Even though I didn't have any information to give them, they wanted to know more about my father. I didn't have, anything to tell them. But they threatened. I remember one of them pulling onto my cheek like this and saying, "Do you like your skin? If you like it and you don't want it to be destroyed, you better, cooperate with us." And I said, "I have nothing to tell you." And I put on a face that I was not afraid, but deep inside I was terrorized. And then they said, "Okay, if you're not, cooperating with us, we'll come back and get you tonight. And then we'll see if you still continue to resist." Then I was asking the guards around there how they torture people, and they were telling me all kinds of stories. The more I heard the stories, the more afraid I was. And as it was customary for them, they would go out to the local bars. They get drunk, and the time they tortured people was after they got drunk. So that night they went out to drink, and then I was just sitting outside in the dark, in the cold, and I was waiting. I was, shivering and very cold. But I said, I'd rather get it over with. And I was just sitting outside and waiting, and I waited, and I waited the whole night. They didn't come. And then it was morning. And then in the morning, one of the officials, I saw him walking into the compound, and, his hair was messed up and his eyes were red. And I said, "What happened?" And I asked one of the guards, and he said, "Let me find out and I'll come back." And then he went and came back, and he said, "You know what happened?" He was laughing, and he said, "They went out to a local bar and they were going to come back and beat you, but they got so drunk they fell asleep. So that's how, the Lord made me, he delivered me from their hands. So after that, people from Geneva, from the Lutheran World Federation, came inquiring. A friend of my father by the name of Christian Krause, he lived in Tanzania and he knew President Nyerere. So he went and talked with him, and he kind of negotiated with Nyerere. Nyerere was a good friend of Mengistu. He negotiated with him, and then they managed to have us released. So I was released first, and after a week, my father was released.
Yeah, that's very emotional. Did jail leave any emotional trauma in your life, or what was it like after you left jail? Individually, how did you feel seeing your father like that, you yourself being like that, and what were some of the things that your father said to you while you were in jail and after both of you were released?
When we were in jail, we didn't have a chance to talk to one another. We were not allowed to talk to one another. But I remember, where he could fetch water was very close to the fence. So there was a child in that jail, a little boy, like a boy of 7 years. So he would send him and he would tell me that I'm coming out to get some water, so you can meet me at the fence. So I would go out and sit, and wait for him. He came with a pitcher, he got some water, and then he would look to the right, look to the left, and if there was no one looking, he would stick his tongue out. So that felt so great, because that was like an assurance to me that he still loved me, because I thought maybe they went and told him, your daughter told us this and that, because that's one of the mechanisms they used to set children against the parents, or parents against their children. So I didn't know what they were telling him. But then when he played with me, that was like an assurance. And I waited for that moment. Every day I waited for him to come and get water. And then, we couldn't talk to one another, but, facial gestures, just reading his facial gestures, maybe smiling at me or making faces. So I was happy, and I knew everything was going fine. Well,
a story that I've heard from you, the day of Gudina's kidnapping on July 28th, 1979, he called you into his office and he asked you a question that I would say is a very weird question for a father to ask a daughter. Could you tell us about that last conversation that you guys had together?
On that Saturday, that was July 28, 1979, my father, whenever he could be home, he sat in his study room, where he had all his books, and he loved reading. If my mom didn't stop him, he would read the whole night. So she always came in and stopped him. She said, it's enough time to rest. But, I went into his room and, I played with him. And he asked me, do you think you'll go back to jail again? And I said, no, I'll never go back to jail again. But before he asked me that, I told him I had a dream last night. And he asked me what the dream was. And I told him that our family was in a forest. We were in the forest and there were some logs on the ground. And then, I wanted to sit on one of them. And then I looked intently into the log, and then I saw it was not a log, it was a large python, a long, large, greenish python. But it looked like wood. It had the color of the forest. And so I told him that. And then he said, do you believe in dreams? I said, yes. I was just saying yes. I didn't know I was saying that. But he said, I don't believe in them. Then he said, do you think you'll go back to jail again? I said, I'll never go back to jail again. But then I asked him, what about you? Do you think you'll go back to jail? He said, I don't know, I might. So that afternoon, after he prepared his sermon for that evening, where he was supposed to go to Urail Mechanics Church and lead a Bible study there. He had been teaching like a series of Bible classes, so he was going there. And I had to go attend a Marxist youth training that we were forced to attend. And he felt that I should go attend because, if I didn't attend, then, you would be labeled as anti-revolutionary. So I had to go and attend, and my mom was driving, and she dropped me off there, and they continued to the church. But I got home before they did in the evening, like around 7 o'clock. That's the time when they were supposed to be back. And, I set up the table and waited for them to come, and we have dinner together as usual. But then, they didn't show up. And then it was 10 o'clock. I was very worried. I was standing outside. The neighbors were there standing outside with me. Finally, a woman who was with them in the car, who was attending church, my mom's friend, she came and, she was screaming and crying. And then, I didn't understand what was going on. And she kept saying, your parents, your parents, your parents. But she didn't say what happened to my parents. And before I found out what had happened to them, I just remember, crying and screaming. And I kind of figured out maybe they took my father or something. And I was crying, and I think I was pulling my hair out. I was not conscious I was doing that. And then the man, Takasta, the youth leader, he came and he said, Lensa, aren't you a Christian? I said, yes. He said, stop doing what you're doing. God is in control. So I kind of calmed down. And then later, my mom came, and she didn't have her purse, she didn't have her car, she didn't have her sweater. And she just came and she said, they took Gudina away. And she was crying and wailing and screaming. And that was a very hard time. But before my mom came, the neighbors said, let's go inside the house and let's pray. And, in the last days, we lived in an apartment of the church because my father knew that he was going to be arrested, and he knew that he was going to be killed. We came to find out that later. He didn't tell us, didn't tell me. I was too young to be told something like that. My mom knew a little bit, but others knew. His colleagues, his friends knew about it. So they sold the house that we were living in, and they had moved to the apartment because he knew there was no use for the house. And besides, they had taken loan to build the house from the church. And so he wanted all the loans settled before he was killed. So we moved to that apartment, and there were neighbors, other church people, and then we knelt down to pray. And then as we knelt down, there was an earthquake that night. It can be traced back, but there was an earthquake. And kneeling down, I felt the earthquake. It was a very unusual feeling, but I knew it was an earthquake. We were just continued to kneel. But I said to myself, I say, Lord, I pray that this building gets destroyed by the earthquake and we all die. I wanted to die because I couldn't imagine, life after my father's disappearance. But, nothing happened. We got up, and then my mother came, and then the search for my father started.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Speaking of the search for your father, after his disappearance, your mother was arrested, I believe 6 months after he disappeared, and then you were left alone. And you left the country. For I believe 13 years, you didn't know what actually happened to your father. What was it like leaving the country? And after 13 years, what was it like finding out about what actually happened to your father that night?
Yeah, after 6 months later, my mother was arrested. And I think that was even, made life much more difficult in her absence, because I was left in the house by myself. And people were afraid. People were afraid. They were afraid to come to our house because they thought they might get arrested too. And so it was a very lonely time. And for me, it was a time to get closer to the Lord, find comfort in Him. But there were, people who prayed with me and comforted me. That was good. And after that, it was God's will that I left the country, and I left the country miraculously. I was not willing to leave the country. I never wanted to go abroad. I always told my parents, my siblings had already gone, but I said, I'm going to live home. I'm not going. I'm going to the university here. I'll never go abroad. But then, the situation became very dangerous, and my mom, from prison, she sent notes. She smuggled out notes saying, you should go, you should go, you should go. And then there were sisters who prayed with her prayer team. And they said, we prayed for your departure for such a long time. And if you have the opportunity, you should leave the country. And a friend of my parents, by the name of Taklu Jallata, arranged for me to leave the country. So it was not easy leaving the country in those days. You had to have an exit visa, they called it. It's not for the country where you were going, but even going out of Ethiopia, you needed a visa from Ethiopia. So getting that was, I don't know how he managed, but he did, and I was able to leave. And so I went to Germany from there. And that's how it continued.
After you found out about your father's death, you and some of your siblings went on to focus on, I would say, rebuilding or maintaining the Gudina Tumsa legacy. You did things such as establish the Gudina Tumsa Foundation, publish the writings that you could find. What was that experience like, picking up the pieces of a life that was almost torn apart by people?
Yeah, you see, before we did that, there were, for me, 13 years. For my siblings, much longer. But for 13 years, we didn't know the whereabouts of my father. But we always harbored the hope in our hearts that he would be somewhere in one of the prisons in Ethiopia. See, my mother, after she was arrested, she was in jail for 10 years. She was tortured severely, multiple times, but she survived it, and she was released after 10 years. So, we had that in mind, that he will also be released. So we waited for him. But it wasn't after the downfall of the Dirk that we found out that he was killed the same night he was kidnapped. When we heard that news, my mother was with me in America, and we had gone to Germany to visit, my eldest sister, Kulani, because she had given birth. And we were there, and when we found out, it was a very hard news. It was very hard to believe. We wanted to deny, for me, I wanted to deny that he even died. I said, who knows, maybe he will be, we might find him. But after that, his remains were found in the old palace, and it was video recorded. It was on television as well. And my father's grave was a separate one. So it was not like others, not to doubt that because he was 2 meters long and his skeleton was intact. So there was no doubt it was him. And after we found out, we had to come back home. And there was a reburial ceremony where all his friends and colleagues and family came, and so a reburial ceremony was conducted. That was very hard. It was a very difficult time to wait for 13 years, hoping that, he'll be found, and find out that he died the same night. And the Derg denied it the whole time. They were, foreign governments, because my father was very well known internationally. Like the Sweden government asked, the German government asked, through their diplomats. But the Derg said, we don't know. And, he said he was kidnapped by other, opposition forces, by the OLF. It's not us. But, imagine in those days, to give that kind of a response, he was kidnapped from Kazanchis in Addis Ababa. And the fact that he was kidnapped right after a church service says it, why he was taken and how he was taken. So, because the government denied it throughout, we thought at the fall of the government, we'll find out, he'll be released. Because many people were released from prison after the downfall of the Derg. But he was not. So it was a hard feeling. I can't explain it, but it was very hard. So after that, the idea of establishing a foundation in his memory, not only in his memory, but to carry on his vision. The vision, he left unfinished, came up, from his friends who had come to the reburial ceremony, a person by the name of Dr. Hasselblatt, who was, in today's language, would have been called an activist. He campaigned all over, Germany and Europe, asking about the whereabouts of Gudina Tumsa. And so he was there. Another person from Berlin Mission by the name of Uwe Holm, Gerd Decker, all his friends came, and they said, his vision should not stop, because he was a man of vision. He had a big vision for his church, and through his church, for his country, for his people. So they said, it should be continued. And in those days, we didn't know anything about, what he thought and what he wrote. His writings were scattered all over. Actually, most of his writings were burned down because, he kept it in the church, and the church people were afraid. They didn't know. The days were very scary days. So, majority of his writings, especially his sermons, were fully destroyed. He kept them in his office in a shelf, I remember. They were fully destroyed. So we don't have any sermons with us, but speeches that he gave, like when he went to Tokyo, or when he spoke in Australia, or in Norway, we have them. So we started collecting his writings to find out what his thoughts were. So with the help of his friends, we did that, and we published what was entitled The Essential Writings of Gudina Tumsa, Witness and Discipleship. So these are like maybe 14 documents that we found, and so we had them published. And then after that, people started lecturing about him, about his theology, what he termed holistic theology. Serving people physically and spiritually, that it should be done in such a manner. So, we started also holding seminars in Addis and in regional seminars in different parts of the country on his theology. Yeah.
To bring our interview to a conclusion, we have one more question for you. What do you think is the most major contribution that the Gudina Tumsa legacy has for this generation?
The articles that he writes are short, but they are, meaning loaded. You can take and synthesize what he writes, and you can find out a lot. And what he writes about is about nation building. That's what I found out, on how citizens should be responsible. And then he's speaking from a Christian perspective. So when he speaks to the church. But he was not speaking only about the church, he was speaking about society, the whole country. So when I read his writings now, I find out how much could be used for nation building for the country. Because the gospel, as he saw it, addressed all human needs, whether it's environmental needs of people or political needs or spiritual needs. The gospel addressed every aspect of human life. So there is still a lot to learn. The church has to learn from his teachings, from his God-given vision, and society has to learn from him. Unfortunately, Gudina Tumsa is not very popular, within his own church or within his country. I think people overseas are more interested. So even speaking to different churches, we get more invitation from overseas than we do here. I've been invited to churches in America several times, or my siblings to Sweden or to Germany. I myself was in Germany a couple times, invited by church groups. Or in Cape Town, South Africa, there was a Gudina Tumsa seminar. In Iringa, Tanzania, there was the Africans wanted to learn from him because he talks about African theology, and he feels that Africans should develop their own theology. So they are challenged by him, and the churches from Europe are also wanting to learn from him. Even when he was alive, he challenged the Western churches as well on theological grounds. So there is still yet a lot to learn for our youth. Unfortunately, the times we are in, people are not interested in reading. So it is very good that you're doing this video, because, after you edit it and make it as short as possible, because, again, people are not interested in long things, maybe they will learn something from it. And then if they hear bits and pieces here, they might be interested to do more. So there is a lot to learn from him. For the unity of the church and for equality. The issue in Ethiopia is the issue of ethnic conflict. He addresses ethnic conflict a lot, and not only speaking, but he made his church a model for ethnic harmony, how you can live in harmony, and in fellowship without conflicting each other, respecting each other as, human beings created in the image of God.
Well, I want to thank you, Lee, for taking time out of your day to spend time with me. I'll call you professionally Lensa, and thank you.
Well, I want to thank you too, Kolu, and thank you for taking so much interest and reviving the legacy of your grandfather. And God bless you, and God bless all your endeavors.
Amen. Thanks.